In the brutal heart of a frontier storm, bounty hunter Caleb Rourke faces the hardest choice of his life. Chase down dangerous criminals or save a dying woman collapsed in the mud. One decision will cost him everything he's worked for. The other might cost him his soul. This is a story about survival, trust, and what happens when a man who spent years running from connection finally stops. If you want to see how far this journey goes, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see where this story reaches. Now let's begin. The rain came down like nails. Caleb Rourke had been riding for 3 days straight, and the storm hit just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Not the soft kind of rain that settles dust. This was the kind that turned trails into rivers and made every breath feel like drowning. His horse, a gray mare named Ash, stumbled twice in the last mile, her hooves slipping on mud that had no bottom. He should have stopped hours ago, should have found shelter, waited it out. But the Garrick brothers were close, maybe a day ahead, maybe less. And if he lost them now, he'd lose the bounty. $2,000, enough to keep him through winter, maybe longer if he was smart about it. Lightning split the sky, and for half a second the world went white. That's when he saw it. A cabin. Small, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, tucked against a stand of pines about 50 yards off the trail. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and struggling against the wind. Caleb pulled Ash to a halt, squinting through the downpour. He'd passed this stretch before, never noticed a cabin here. Then again, he'd never been looking. Another flash of lightning, and that's when he saw her. A woman. Face down in the mud, about 20 feet from the cabin door, not moving. Caleb sat there for a moment, water streaming off the brim of his hat, weighing it. She could be drunk. Could be dead already. Could be bait. Some kind of trap set by drifters, or worse. The Garricks had friends all over this territory, and they weren't above using a woman to draw a man in. But then her hand moved, just a little, fingers curling into the mud like she was trying to pull herself forward. "Damn it," Caleb muttered. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a wet slap. Ash snorted, shaking her head, but she stayed put. Caleb moved fast, crossing the distance in long strides. The woman was small, dressed in a plain cotton dress that was soaked through and caked with mud, dark hair plastered to her skull. He crouched down, got a hand under her shoulder, and turned her over. She gasped, a sharp, broken sound, and her eyes flew open. Brown eyes, wide with panic. "Easy," Caleb said. "Easy. I got you." She tried to speak, but nothing came out except a wet cough. Her skin was cold, lips almost blue. Hypothermia, maybe. He didn't know how long she'd been out here, but it was long enough. "Can you stand?" She shook her head, barely. Caleb didn't wait for permission. He slid one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her like she weighed nothing. She didn't fight, just went limp against his chest, shivering hard enough that he could feel it through his coat. The cabin door was open, swinging on one hinge. Caleb kicked it wider and stepped inside. It wasn't much. Single room, dirt floor, a stone fireplace with a fire that was down to embers, a narrow bed in the corner, a table, 2 chairs. The kind of place someone lived because they had no other choice. He carried her to the bed and set her down as gently as he could. She curled onto her side immediately, still shaking. Caleb looked around, spotted a blanket folded on the back of one of the chairs, and threw it over her. Then he went to the fireplace, grabbed a couple of logs from the stack beside it, and built the fire back up. The heat started to fill the room, slow but steady. Caleb stood there for a moment, watching her. She was young, mid-20s maybe, face pale and drawn like she hadn't eaten well in a while. Her dress was patched in a couple of places, careful stitching that somebody had taken time with. "What the hell were you doing out there?" he said, not really expecting an answer. She didn't give him one, just kept shaking. Caleb turned back to the door, peered out into the storm. Ash was still standing where he'd left her, head down, miserable. He should bring her in, get her dried off. But the cabin was barely big enough for 2 people, let alone a horse. He stepped outside, grabbed Ash's reins, and led her around to the side of the cabin where the overhang gave a little cover. Not much, but better than nothing. He tied her off, pulled the saddle and his gear, and hauled it all inside. By the time he got back in, the woman had stopped shaking so hard. Her eyes were open, tracking him as he moved. "You got a name?" Caleb asked, shaking water off his hat. She swallowed, winced like it hurt. Eliza. Her voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Eliza what? Whitmore. Caleb nodded. I'm Caleb. Caleb Rourke. She didn't say anything to that, just watched him with those wide brown eyes. What happened? He asked. Why were you out there? Eliza looked away toward the fire. I don't know. I remember the storm started. I was trying to get the chickens in, and then I felt dizzy. I think I fell. You live here alone? She hesitated, then nodded. Caleb frowned. That's a bad idea. I don't have much choice. Fair enough. He didn't push it. He dragged one of the chairs closer to the fire, sat down, and started pulling off his wet coat. Underneath, his shirt was soaked too, but there wasn't much he could do about that. He hung the coat over the back of the chair and leaned forward, holding his hands out to the heat. You hungry? Eliza asked. Caleb glanced at her. She was sitting up now, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Still pale, but some color was coming back to her face. You don't have to just... I'm asking if you're hungry. He almost smiled. Yeah, I am. She stood, a little unsteady, and moved to the table. There was a pot there covered with a cloth. She lifted it, peered inside, then set it on the edge of the fireplace to warm. Stew, she said. Not much, but it's hot. Hot's enough. They didn't talk while the stew heated. Caleb watched her move around the small space, efficient, careful, like someone who'd learned not to waste motion. She found 2 bowls, ladled out the stew, and handed him one without a word. It was thin, more broth than meat, but it was warm, and that was all that mattered. Thank you, Caleb said. Eliza sat down on the edge of the bed, holding her own bowl. You saved my life. Maybe. No, maybe about it. I was dying out there. Caleb shrugged. You'd have done the same. Would I? He didn't have an answer for that. They ate in silence. Outside, the storm hammered against the walls, but inside, the fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. When Eliza finished, she set her bowl aside and looked at him. You're a long way from anywhere. I'm tracking someone. Who? Doesn't matter. It does if they're dangerous. Caleb met her eyes. They are. She didn't flinch. How dangerous? Dangerous enough that I need to keep moving. Soon as this storm breaks, I'm gone. And if it doesn't break, then I'm stuck here with you. Eliza smiled, just a little, just at the corner of her mouth. Could be worse. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Could it? You could be dead in the mud. He snorted. Fair point. The fire crackled. Eliza pulled the blanket tighter. How long have you been out here? Caleb asked. 2 years? Maybe 3? I lose track. Alone the whole time? No, my husband was here. Until he wasn't. Caleb didn't ask. He knew that tone. You ever think about leaving? He said instead. Every day. So why don't you? Eliza looked at the fire. Because I don't have anywhere to go. That, Caleb understood. The storm didn't break. By morning, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the wind was still howling, and the trail outside was a knee-deep river of mud. Caleb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring out at the gray mess of the world. You're not going anywhere today, Eliza said from behind him. I can see that. The Garrick brothers can wait. Caleb turned. I didn't tell you who I was tracking. Eliza was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a tin cup of something hot. You didn't have to. They came through here 2 days ago, stopped for water. One of them tried to take more than that. Caleb's jaw tightened. What happened? I shot at him. Hit him? No. But I got close enough that they left. Caleb stared at her. You live out here alone and you shot at the Garrick brothers. I didn't know who they were at the time. Doesn't matter. They're the kind who remember. Eliza shrugged. Let them remember. I'm still here. Caleb shook his head. This woman was either the bravest person he'd ever met or the most reckless. Maybe both. They say where they were headed? He asked. North, toward the river crossing. Caleb nodded. That matched what he'd heard. If the Garricks were headed for the river, they'd try to cross before the water got too high. But with this storm, the river would be running fast and mean. They might be stuck on this side for days. which meant Caleb had time. "You got any coffee?" he asked. Eliza pointed to a tin on the shelf. "Help yourself." He did. The coffee was weak, but it was hot, and it cut the chill that had settled into his bones. He sat down across from her, cradling the cup in both hands. "Tell me about them," Eliza said. "The Garricks?" "Yeah," Caleb sighed. "What do you want to know?" "Why you're chasing them." "They killed a man. His family's offering $2,000 to bring them in." "Dead or alive?" "Preferably alive. But I'll take what I can get." Eliza studied him. "You do this a lot?" "Enough. And you're good at it?" "I'm still here." She smiled again, that same small, almost hidden smile. "So am I." Caleb found himself smiling back. "Yeah, you are." Inta. The day passed slow. Caleb checked on Ash twice, made sure she had water and what little grain he'd brought. The mare was tired but holding up. By midday, the rain had stopped, but the sky stayed low and gray, and the wind didn't let up. Inside, Eliza moved through her routines like he wasn't there. She tended the fire, mended a tear in one of her blankets, swept the dirt floor even though it didn't need it. Caleb watched her without meaning to. There was something about the way she moved, steady, purposeful, like she'd learned to fill the hours just to keep from thinking too much. He knew that feeling. "You got any family?" Eliza asked suddenly. Caleb blinked. "No?" "None?" "Not anymore." She didn't press, just nodded and went back to her mending. "You?" Caleb asked. "A brother. Lives back east. Haven't seen him in years." "He know you're out here?" "Probably. He sent a letter once. I never answered." "Why not?" Eliza set down her needle and thread. "Because he'd tell me to come home, and I'm not ready to hear that." Caleb understood that too. That night they shared another thin stew and sat by the fire. The wind had finally died down, and the silence felt almost loud after so much noise. "You can take the bed," Eliza said. "I'll sleep in the chair." "No." "You're a guest." "I'm a stranger who showed up in the middle of a storm. You take the bed. I've slept in worse places." She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't, just pulled the blanket around herself and lay down. Caleb stretched out on the floor near the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm, and that was enough. He listened to the sound of Eliza breathing, slow and steady, and tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd spent the night anywhere that felt even remotely like this. Safe. He fell asleep without meaning to. By the third day, the trail was still too wet to ride, but the sky had cleared. Caleb spent the morning chopping wood, more than Eliza would need for a week, but it gave him something to do. She watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a faint smile on her face. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." "So why are you?" Caleb drove the axe into the chopping block and straightened. "Because you saved my life too." "How do you figure that?" "If I'd kept riding that night, I'd have been caught in the worst of it. Probably would have drowned in some gully. You gave me a reason to stop." Eliza's smile widened. "So we're even?" "We're even." That afternoon, they sat outside in the weak sunlight, and Eliza told him about her life before the cabin. She'd grown up back east, married young to a man who'd promised her adventure. They'd come west together, bought this land, tried to make something of it, and then he'd gotten sick. "Fever," she said, "took him in less than a week. I buried him out back," she said, nodding toward the trees, "under the big pine." Caleb didn't say he was sorry. He figured she'd heard that enough. "You ever think about starting over?" he asked instead. "Every day. But starting over costs money, and I don't have any." "You could sell this place." "To who? Nobody wants land this far out." She wasn't wrong. "What about you?" Eliza asked. "You ever think about stopping?" Caleb leaned back against the cabin wall. "Sometimes." "Why don't you?" "Because I don't know what I'd do if I did." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "You'd figure it out?" "Maybe." That night they talked longer than they had before. About nothing and everything. About places they'd been, things they'd seen, mistakes they'd made. Caleb found himself saying things he hadn't said to anyone in years. And Eliza listened, really listened. When he finally stretched out by the fire, he didn't fall asleep right away. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the Garricks and the bounty and the life he'd been living for the past 5 years. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered if there might be something else. On the 4th morning, Caleb woke to the smell of coffee. Eliza was already up, moving around the cabin with that same quiet efficiency. She handed him a cup without a word, and he took it, grateful. "Trail should be clear today," she said. "Yeah. You'll leave." It wasn't a question. "I should," Caleb said. "But?" He looked at her. "But I don't want to." Eliza set down her own cup. "Then don't." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because I've got a job to finish." "And after that?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have one. Eliza stepped closer. "You know what I think? I think you've been running so long you forgot what it's like to stand still." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, because she was right. "Stay," Eliza said. "One more day. Just one." Caleb wanted to say no. Wanted to saddle Ash and ride out before he got any more tangled up in this. But when he looked at Eliza, really looked at her, he couldn't do it. "One more day," he said. She smiled. Eat. That day they didn't talk much. They worked together. Caleb fixed a loose board on the cabin wall. Eliza cleaned and cooked. It was easy, natural, like they'd been doing it for years instead of days. And when the sun started to set, Caleb knew he was in trouble, because he didn't want to leave. Not tomorrow, not ever. That night they sat by the fire again. But this time Eliza sat closer, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You're going to leave in the morning," she said. "I have to." "I know." They sat in silence for a while. Then Eliza spoke again, her voice quiet. "Promise me something." "What?" "If you come back this way, stop in, even if it's just for a night." Caleb looked at her. "I promise." She smiled. Liar. He laughed. Actually laughed, and it felt strange and good at the same time. "I mean it," he said. "We'll see." The next morning, Caleb saddled Ash while Eliza stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't look at her until he was ready to mount up. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reminding me what this feels like." Eliza stepped forward and put a hand on his arm. "Come back, Caleb." "I will." He swung into the saddle and turned Ash toward the trail. He didn't look back, because if he did, he knew he'd never leave. The trail north was worse than Caleb expected. What should have been a 2-day ride turned into 3, then 4. The storm had torn through the territory like a knife, leaving behind washed-out gullies and fallen trees that forced him to backtrack more times than he could count. Ash picked her way through the mess with the patience of a saint, but even she was getting worn down. Caleb didn't mind. The slower pace gave him time to think, and thinking was dangerous, because every mile he put between himself and that cabin, he felt it pulling at him, like a rope tied around his chest, getting tighter the farther he rode. He'd left plenty of places before, towns, camps, people, and never looked back. But this was different. Eliza was different. He tried to tell himself it was just proximity. 4 days trapped in a small space with someone would make anybody feel attached. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't. But then he'd remember the way she looked at him across the fire, the way she smiled when he chopped wood like it was some kind of joke between them, the way her hand felt on his arm when she asked him to come back. And he'd know he was lying to himself. By the time he reached the river crossing, the sun was setting, and Caleb was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. The river was high and fast, just like he'd figured, churning brown with runoff from the mountains. No way across. Not tonight. Maybe not for days. He made camp on the bank, built a small fire, and sat there watching the water. The Garricks were on the other side by now, had to be, which meant the trail was cold and the bounty was slipping away. He should have cared more than he did. That night, he lay in his bedroll staring up at the stars, and all he could think about was Eliza alone in that cabin, fixing her own meals, chopping her own wood, sitting by the fire with nobody to talk to. He wondered if she was thinking about him. Probably not, he told himself. She was practical, smart. She knew better than to get tangled up with a drifter who'd be gone the second the job was done. But then he remembered what she'd said. "Come back, Caleb." and he wondered if maybe she didn't know better after all. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of voices. He sat up fast, hand already on his revolver. 2 men were standing about 30 yards downstream, watering their horses. They hadn't seen him yet. Caleb watched them for a moment, taking stock. Both were armed. Both looked like they'd been on the trail a while. One of them had a scar running down the side of his face that caught the early light. Not the Garricks, but not friendly either. Caleb stood slowly, making sure they saw him before he moved. The man with the scar turned, hand drifting toward his gun. "Easy," Caleb said. "Just passing through." The man looked him over, then relaxed a fraction. "You crossing?" "Thinking about it." "Don't. River's too high. Lost a horse yesterday trying." Caleb nodded. "Appreciate the warning." The second man, younger and fidgety, spoke up. "You see anybody else come through here? 2 men, riding together?" Caleb's instincts prickled. "Who's asking?" "Nobody, just curious." "Then no, haven't seen anybody." The scarred man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good luck with the river." They mounted up and rode off, heading south. Caleb waited until they were out of sight, then kicked dirt over his fire and saddled Ash. He didn't know if those men were connected to the Garricks, but he wasn't about to stick around and find out. He spent the next 2 days working his way upstream, looking for a place to cross. The river stayed mean, but eventually he found a spot where it widened out and slowed down just enough. He walked Ash into the water, talking to her the whole time, keeping her steady as the current pushed against her legs. They made it halfway before the bottom dropped out. 1 second Ash was walking, the next she was swimming, and Caleb was holding onto the saddle with both hands, letting the current carry them downstream while he fought to keep them angled toward the far bank. The water was cold enough to stop his breath, and for a few seconds he thought they were going to get swept away completely. But Ash was strong, and she fought for every inch. They hit the far bank about 100 yards down from where they'd started, scrambling up onto dry ground with water streaming off them both. Caleb sat there for a minute, breathing hard, while Ash shook herself off like a dog. "Good girl," he said, patting her neck. "You earned your grain today." He wrung out his coat as best he could, checked his rifle to make sure it hadn't taken on too much water, and kept moving. By the time he picked up the Garrick's trail again, it was almost dark. Fresh tracks, no more than a day old, heading northeast toward the high country. Caleb followed them until the light failed, then made camp and tried to sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza, sitting by the fire, standing in the doorway, smiling that small, hidden smile. "You're going to leave in the morning." "I have to." "I know." He rolled over, stared at the coals of his fire, and admitted something he'd been avoiding for days. He didn't want to catch the Garricks, because once he did, there'd be no reason to go back, no excuse. And if he went back without a reason, it meant something. It meant he was choosing her over the life he'd built, over the only thing he knew how to do, and that scared him more than any outlaw ever had. The next morning, Caleb found the Garrick's camp, or what was left of it. Cold fire, empty whiskey bottles, the remains of a rabbit roasted on a spit. They'd been here maybe 12 hours ago, close enough that if Caleb pushed hard, he could catch them by nightfall. He stood there for a long time, looking at the tracks leading out of camp. Then he turned and looked back the way he'd come, south, toward the river, toward the cabin, toward Eliza. He could go back. Right now. Forget the Garricks, forget the bounty, just turn around and ride. But what would he say when he got there? What could he possibly offer her that was worth staying for? He was a bounty hunter, a drifter. He didn't have land, didn't have money, didn't have anything except a horse and a rifle and a reputation for bringing in men who didn't want to be brought in. That wasn't a life. Not for someone like Eliza. Caleb swore under his breath, mounted Ash, and followed the Garrick's trail. He rode hard for the next 6 hours, pushing Ash faster than he should have. The trail led up into the foothills, through stands of pine and scrub oak, across rocky ground that made the tracks harder to follow. But Caleb had been doing this long enough that he could read the land like a book. By mid-afternoon, he could smell smoke. He slowed, moving quieter now, eyes scanning the trees ahead. The trail curved around a low ridge, and that's when he saw it. Another camp, this one still active. 2 men sitting by a fire, rifles leaning against a log beside them. The Garrick brothers. Caleb dismounted, tied Ash to a tree, and pulled his rifle. He moved through the trees until he had a clear line of sight, then settled into position behind a fallen log. He could take them from here. Easy shot. Both of them dead before they knew what hit them. But the family wanted them alive, which meant he had to get closer. Caleb waited, watching. The brothers were relaxed, talking in low voices he couldn't quite make out. One of them, the older one, Frank, stood and stretched, then walked off into the trees to relieve himself. That left Tommy alone by the fire. Caleb moved. He came in fast and low, rifle up, boots barely making a sound on the pine needles. He was 10 feet away when Tommy looked up, eyes going wide. "Don't," Caleb said. Tommy's hand twitched toward his gun. Caleb fired. The shot kicked up dirt 2 inches from Tommy's hand, and the younger Garrick jerked back with a yelp. "Next one goes through your wrist," Caleb said. "Now stand up, slow." Tommy stood, hands out to his sides. He was younger than Caleb expected, mid-20s maybe, skinny, with a patchy beard and eyes that darted around like a cornered animal. "Where's your brother?" Caleb asked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. Frank? Where is he?" "He left." "Try again." A twig snapped behind Caleb. He spun, but he was a half-second too slow. Frank came out of the trees swinging a thick branch like a club, and it caught Caleb across the shoulders hard enough to knock him forward. He hit the ground, rifle flying out of his hands, and rolled just in time to avoid Frank's boot coming down where his head had been. Caleb came up with his revolver, but Frank kicked it out of his hand before he could aim. The older Garrick was bigger than his brother, thick through the chest and arms, with a face that looked like it had been hit too many times to care about being hit again. "You stupid or just suicidal?" Frank said. Caleb didn't answer. He lunged, got inside Frank's reach, and drove a fist into the man's ribs. Frank grunted but didn't go down. He grabbed Caleb by the coat, spun him around, and threw him into a tree. Caleb's head cracked against the bark, and the world went white for a second. By the time his vision cleared, Frank had his revolver, and Tommy had picked up the rifle. "You're that bounty hunter," Frank said. "Rourke, right?" Caleb spit blood. "Yeah. You've been dogging us for a week." "Longer than that," Frank laughed. "Well, you caught us. Now what?" "Now you come with me. Or I kill you and take you in anyway." Frank looked at Tommy, then back at Caleb. "You're not in a real good position to be making threats. Neither are you. You kill me, there'll be 10 more coming after you, and they won't care about bringing you in alive." Frank's smile faded. "Maybe, but you'll still be dead." He raised the revolver. Caleb didn't flinch, just stared him down. "Do it." Frank hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. A gunshot cracked through the trees, and Frank jerked sideways, blood blooming across his shoulder. He dropped the revolver, clutching at the wound, and spun around. Eliza stepped out of the trees, shotgun leveled at Frank's chest. "Don't move," she said. Caleb stared. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your life." "Again." Tommy swung the rifle toward her, but Caleb was already moving. He tackled the younger Garrick from the side, and they went down in a tangle of limbs. Caleb got on top, pinned Tommy's arms, and slammed his head against the ground once, hard. Tommy went limp. Frank was still on his feet, bleeding but not out. He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb, then at the revolver on the ground. "Don't," Eliza said. Frank lunged for it. Eliza pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, and Frank went down like a felled tree. He landed on his back, clutching his leg, screaming. Caleb stood, breathing hard, and looked at Eliza. She was pale, hands shaking, but the shotgun didn't waver. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "You?" "Yeah." Caleb walked over, picked up his revolver, and checked the Garricks. Tommy was unconscious but alive. Frank's leg was a mess, but he'd live long enough to stand trial. "How did you find me?" Caleb asked. Eliza lowered the shotgun. "I followed you." "For 4 days?" "5, actually. You're not as careful as you think." Caleb almost smiled. "Why?" "Because I knew you'd do something stupid." "Like what?" "Like getting yourself killed trying to bring in 2 men by yourself." She wasn't wrong. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was covered in trail dust, her dress torn in 2 places, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. But she was here. She'd followed him through a storm, across a flooded river, into the middle of nowhere. For him. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Probably not. It's dangerous. I noticed." "Eliza, don't." She stepped closer. "Don't tell me I should have stayed home. Don't tell me it was too risky. I made my choice." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was crazy for following him, but when he looked into her eyes, he couldn't do it, because he was glad she was here. "Help me tie them up," he said instead. They worked together, using rope from Caleb's saddle to bind the Garrick's hands and feet. Frank kept swearing and spitting blood. Tommy stayed out cold. When they were secure, Caleb dragged them both closer to the fire and left them there. Eliza sat down on the log, still holding the shotgun across her lap. Caleb sat beside her. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, nodding at the gun. "It was my husband's. I brought it when I left." "You know how to use it?" "I do now." Caleb shook his head. "You're full of surprises." "So are you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. Frank had stopped swearing and was just groaning now. Tommy still hadn't moved. "What happens next?" Eliza asked. "I take them in. Collect the bounty." "And after that?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire, then at the Garricks, then at Eliza. "I don't know," he said finally. "Yes, you do." He met her eyes. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth." Caleb took a breath. "The truth is, I didn't want to catch them." "Why not?" "Because once I did, I'd have to decide whether to go back or keep moving. And I've been moving my whole life. I don't know how to stop." Eliza reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. "Then learn," she said. Caleb looked down at their hands, then back at her. "It's not that simple." "It is if you let it be." He wanted to believe her, wanted to think it could be that easy, but he'd spent too many years running to think he could just stop because someone asked him to. "I'll take you back," he said, "after I turn them in. I'll make sure you get home safe." Eliza let go of his hand. "I'm not going back." "What?" "I'm not going back to that cabin. I told you I don't have anywhere to go, so I'm coming with you." "Eliza, don't argue. I already decided." Caleb stared at her. "You can't just—" "Why not? You did." "That's different." "How?" "Because I'm—" He stopped, because he didn't have a good answer. Eliza stood. "I'm coming with you. You can argue all you want, but it won't change anything." Caleb stood too. "You don't know what you're signing up for." "Then tell me." "It's hard. It's dangerous. Half the time I don't know where I'm sleeping or when I'm eating. I've been shot at, stabbed, beaten, left for dead more times than I can count. That's the life. That's what you'd be walking into." Eliza didn't blink. "Sounds better than what I'm walking away from." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, because she was right. "Fine," he said, "but when you get tired of it—" "I won't. You don't know that. Neither do you." He almost smiled. Almost. They spent the night taking turns keeping watch. Caleb took the first shift, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his knees while Eliza slept a few feet away. Frank stayed quiet after Caleb threatened to gag him. Tommy woke up once, groaned, and passed out again. Caleb watched the stars and tried to figure out what the hell he was doing. He'd spent 5 years building a reputation, 5 years proving he didn't need anybody, didn't want anybody, didn't care about anything except the next job. And now here he was, sitting in the dark with a woman who'd blown a hole in all of that without even trying. He should have been angry, should have told her to go home and leave him alone. But he wasn't, and he didn't. Because somewhere in the last week, something had shifted, and he didn't know how to shift it back. When Eliza woke to take her turn, Caleb lay down by the fire and closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. He kept thinking about what she'd said, then learn. Like it was that simple. Like he could just decide to be a different person and make it happen. But maybe she was right. Maybe it was simple. Maybe he was just making it hard. The next morning, they started south. Caleb rode Ash with Frank slung over the saddle in front of him, hands tied to the horn. Tommy walked, hands bound behind his back, with a rope around his waist that Caleb held like a leash. Eliza rode Frank's horse, the shotgun resting across her lap. It was slow going. Frank's leg was bad enough that he kept passing out from the pain, and Tommy complained every mile until Caleb threatened to drag him the rest of the way. "How far?" Eliza asked around midday. 3 days, maybe 4. To where? Nearest town with the sheriff, place called Ridgeway. You been there before? Once. It's rough, but they pay bounties without asking too many questions. Eliza nodded. She'd been quiet most of the morning, and Caleb couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or second thoughts. You okay? He asked. Fine. You don't look fine. I'm just tired. Caleb didn't push it. They rode in silence for another hour before Eliza spoke again. What will you do after? After what? After you collect the bounty. Caleb shrugged. Find another job. And I come with you? If you want. What if I don't want that? Caleb looked at her. Then what do you want? Eliza met his eyes. I want to stop running. I'm not running. Yes, you are. You just call it work. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. That night they made camp in a shallow canyon that gave them cover from the wind. Caleb built the fire while Eliza tended to the horses. The Garricks sat against a rock, tied back to back, looking miserable. You're making a mistake, Frank said. Caleb didn't look up. How's that? Dragging us in like this? There's easier money out there. Maybe, but I already put in the work. We could cut you in. You let us go, we split what we got. 3 ways. How much? Couple hundred, each. Caleb snorted. I'm getting 2,000 for you. Why would I take a couple hundred? Frank didn't have an answer for that. Eliza sat down beside Caleb close enough that their shoulders touched. You think they'll try something? Probably, but they won't get far. How do you know? Because I've done this before. They ate dried meat and hardtack, washed down with water from a creek they'd passed an hour back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After, Eliza leaned against Caleb's shoulder, and he didn't move away. Tell me something, she said. Like what? Something true. Caleb thought about it. I'm scared. Of what? Of this. Of you. Of what happens if I stop moving. Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. Then she took his hand. Me too, she said. And for the first time in as long as Caleb could remember, he didn't feel alone. They reached Ridgeway on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and it looked exactly like Caleb remembered. 24 buildings scattered along a muddy street, half of them leaning like they might fall over if the wind picked up. The kind of town that existed because somebody found silver in the hills 20 years ago and forgot to leave when the silver ran out. The sheriff's office was at the far end of the street, a squat wooden building with bars on the windows and a sign so faded you could barely read it. Caleb dismounted, handed Ash's reins to Eliza, and hauled Frank off the saddle. The older Garrick hit the ground hard and didn't get up. Move, Caleb said, nudging him with his boot. Frank groaned but didn't argue. He limped toward the office, Tommy shuffling behind him, and Caleb followed with his hand on his revolver. Eliza stayed with his horses, watching the street like she expected trouble. She wasn't wrong to. Inside, the sheriff was asleep at his desk, boots up, hat pulled low over his face. Caleb kicked the desk leg, and the man jerked awake, nearly falling out of his chair. What the? He blinked, focused on Caleb, then on the Garricks. Oh, you're back. I am. The sheriff was older than Caleb, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and a gut that said he spent more time drinking than chasing outlaws. His name was Porter, and he'd been wearing the badge for as long as anyone could remember. These the Garrick brothers? Porter asked. They are. Porter stood, walked around the desk, and looked them over. Frank's bleeding. He tried to run. Did he now? Porter didn't sound surprised. Well, get them in a cell. I'll wire the family, let them know we got them. Caleb shoved the Garricks into the single cell at the back of the office and locked the door. Frank collapsed onto the cot, still holding his leg. Tommy sat on the floor, head in his hands. How long until the family gets here? Caleb asked. Day or two. They're coming from Denver, so it'll take some time. Porter sat back down at his desk and pulled out a ledger. You want the bounty now, or wait until they confirm? Now. Porter raised an eyebrow. Eager to leave? Something like that. The sheriff counted out $2,000 in bills and gold, sliding it across the desk. Caleb checked it, folded it into his coat, and turned to go. "Rourke," Porter said. Caleb stopped. "Who's the woman?" "Nobody." "She doesn't look like nobody." Caleb turned back, and his expression must have said enough because Porter held up his hands. "Just asking. No harm meant." "She's with me. That's all you need to know." Porter nodded. "Fair enough. But you might want to get her inside somewhere. Storm's coming." Caleb looked out the window. The sky was clear. "Trust me," Porter said. "I've been here long enough to know. You got maybe an hour before it hits." Caleb left without another word. Outside, Eliza was still standing with the horses, but she'd drawn a small crowd, 3 men, rough-looking, the kind who worked the mines until the work ran out and then didn't know what to do with themselves. One of them was talking to her, standing too close, and Eliza had her hand on the shotgun. Caleb crossed the street fast. "Problem?" he said. The man turned. He was big, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been broken and put back together wrong. "No problem, just being friendly." "She doesn't look like she wants friends." The man grinned. "Maybe she just hasn't met the right one yet." Caleb stepped between them. "Move along." The big man's grin faded. "You telling me what to do?" "I'm asking nice. Won't ask twice." For a moment, it could have gone either way. Then one of the other men put a hand on the big one's shoulder and said something low. The big man spat in the dirt, gave Caleb a long look, and walked off. Caleb waited until they were gone, then turned to Eliza. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You sure?" "I had it handled." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." Eliza almost smiled. "I'm okay. Really." Caleb took Ash's reins. "Porter says there's a storm coming. We should find a place to stay." "There's a hotel, if you can call it that." The hotel was across the street, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sign that said rooms in letters that didn't quite line up. Inside, the lobby smelled like old smoke and something Caleb couldn't identify and didn't want to. The clerk was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked up when they walked in. "Help you?" "Need a room," Caleb said. "1 or 2?" Caleb glanced at Eliza. She didn't say anything. "2," he said. The clerk handed over 2 keys. "Upstairs. End of the hall. $1 a night. Pay up front." Caleb paid, took the keys, and headed for the stairs. Eliza followed. The rooms were small and plain. Bed, chair, washstand, nothing else. Caleb's overlooked the street. Eliza's overlooked an alley. He checked both, made sure the windows locked, then stood in the hallway between them. "You need anything?" he asked. "No." You sure?" Eliza leaned against the doorframe. "Caleb, I'm fine. Stop worrying." "Can't help it." "Why not?" "Because you followed me into the middle of nowhere and nearly got yourself killed." "So did you." He didn't have an answer for that. Eliza stepped closer. "I chose this. You didn't make me come. I wanted to." "Why?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because I'm tired of being alone." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. "Eliza, don't." She put a hand on his arm. "Don't tell me it's a bad idea. I already know, but I don't care." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she deserved better than this, better than him. But when he looked into her eyes, he couldn't do it. "Get some rest," he said instead. "I'll be across the hall if you need me." Eliza nodded and stepped back into her room, closing the door softly. Caleb stood there for a moment, then went into his own room and sat on the bed. The money was heavy in his coat, and he pulled it out, counted it again, just to make sure it was real. $2,000. More than he'd had in one place in years. Enough to buy land, build something, start over, if he wanted to. He thought about Eliza in the next room, thought about the way she looked at him, the way she'd followed him without asking for anything in return. And he thought about what would happen when this was over. When the storm passed and the roads cleared and there was nothing left to keep them together. Would she stay? Or would she realize what he'd known all along, that he wasn't worth staying for? The storm hit just after dark. Caleb was lying on the bed, still dressed, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. It came fast and mean, just like Porter said it would, turning the street outside into a river of mud. Lightning lit up the room every few seconds, followed by thunder that rattled the windows. Caleb got up, checked his revolver out of habit, and looked out into the hall. Eliza's door was closed. No light underneath. He went back to bed and tried to sleep, but it didn't come. Too much noise. Too much thinking. Around midnight, he heard a knock. He sat up, hand already on his gun. "Yeah? It's me, Eliza." Caleb got up and opened the door. She was standing there in the same dress she'd been wearing all day, hair loose around her shoulders, looking smaller than usual. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No." "Storm?" "Something like that." Caleb stepped aside. "Come in." She did, and he closed the door behind her. For a moment, they just stood there, not saying anything. Then Eliza sat down on the edge of the bed, and Caleb pulled the chair over and sat across from her. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. "Not really." "Okay." They sat in silence. Outside, the storm kept pounding. "I keep thinking about what happens next," Eliza said finally. "What do you mean? After this? After the bounty's paid and the storm clears, what happens to us?" Caleb looked at his hands. "I don't know." "Do you want to know?" "I'm not sure I get a say." Eliza leaned forward. "You get as much say as I do." "Then what do you want?" "I want to stop pretending this is temporary." Caleb met her eyes. "What if that's all it can be?" "Why?" "Because I don't know how to be anything else. I don't know how to stay." "Then learn." "You keep saying that like it's easy." "It's not, but it's possible." Caleb shook his head. "You don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do. I'm asking you to try." He wanted to. Wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in a long time, but wanting something and being able to do it were two different things. "I'll hurt you," he said. "Eventually. I'll leave. Or I'll mess it up. Or I'll—" "Stop." Eliza stood, crossed the space between them, and took his face in her hands. "Stop deciding what I can handle. That's my choice, not yours." Caleb looked up at her, and for the first time in years he felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept locked down so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'm scared," he said. "I know. I don't know if I can do this." "I know that too." "Then why—" "Because I think you're worth the risk." Caleb closed his eyes. Her hands were warm against his face, steady, and he let himself lean into them just a little. "Stay here tonight," he said. "Not like that. Just stay." Eliza nodded. "Okay." She lay down on the bed, still dressed, and Caleb stretched out beside her. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. They lay there listening to the storm, and somewhere in the middle of it, Caleb fell asleep. When he woke, it was still dark, but the rain had stopped. Eliza was asleep beside him, breathing slow and even. Caleb lay there for a moment, just watching her, and tried to remember the last time he'd felt this close to something real. He couldn't. The next morning, Caleb woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Eliza gone. He sat up fast, heart pounding, and looked around the room. Her boots were gone. The door was closed, but not locked. He pulled on his own boots, grabbed his coat, and headed downstairs. The lobby was empty except for the clerk, who looked up from his newspaper. "Your friend left about an hour ago." "Where'd she go?" "Didn't say, just walked out." Caleb swore under his breath and pushed through the door into the street. The mud from the storm was already drying in the sun, and the town was starting to wake up. He looked both ways, didn't see her, and started walking. He found her at the edge of town, standing by the river, looking out at the water. "You planning on leaving without saying goodbye?" he asked. Eliza didn't turn. "No." "Then what are you doing out here?" "Thinking." Caleb walked up beside her. The river was still high from the storm, brown and fast, carrying branches and debris downstream. "About what?" he asked. "About whether this is real." "What do you mean?" Eliza turned to face him. "I mean, is this just something that happened because we were both in the same place at the same time? Or is it something more?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the river, then back at her. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never done this before." "Neither have I. Not like this." "Then I guess we're both guessing." Eliza almost smiled. "That's not very reassuring." "I know, but it's the truth." She stepped closer. "What do you want, Caleb?" Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? Caleb took a breath. I want to stop running. Then stop. It's not that simple. It is if you let it be. You keep saying that because it's true. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was tired, her dress was torn, her hair was a mess. But she was here. She'd followed him through hell and back, and she was still here. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay, I'll try. Eliza's eyes went wide. You mean it? I don't know, but I'm willing to find out. She smiled then, really smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. That's all I'm asking, she said. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then Eliza took his hand and they walked back toward town together. They were halfway there when they saw the horse. It was tied up outside the hotel, a big black gelding with a saddle that looked expensive. Caleb slowed, eyes narrowing. What? Eliza asked. That horse. I've seen it before. Where? I don't know, but I don't like it. They walked up to the hotel, and Caleb pushed through the door. The clerk looked up, nervous. Who owns that horse? Caleb asked. Man came in about 20 minutes ago. Asked for you by name. What man? Didn't give one. He's upstairs. Your room. Caleb's hand went to his revolver. Stay here, he said to Eliza. Not a chance. Eliza, I'm coming. He didn't have time to argue. He took the stairs 2 at a time, Eliza right behind him, and stopped at his door. It was open. Inside, a man was sitting in the chair by the window. Tall, well-dressed, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He looked up when Caleb walked in, and his expression was hard. Eliza, the man said. Eliza stopped in the doorway. Thomas. Caleb looked between them. You know him? He's my brother. Thomas stood. We need to talk. Caleb's hand stayed on his gun. About what? About my sister, and why she's wasting her time with a drifter. Eliza stepped forward. Thomas, don't. Don't what? Don't tell the truth? You disappeared for 2 years, Eliza. No letters, no word. I had to hire men to find you. I didn't ask you to. You're my sister. What was I supposed to do? Leave me alone. Thomas's jaw tightened. I'm taking you home. I'm not going. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. But Caleb stepped between them. She said no. Thomas looked at him like he was dirt. This doesn't concern you. She's with me. That makes it my concern. She's with you because she doesn't know any better. You're taking advantage of her. I'm not taking advantage of anyone. Really? Then what are you offering her? A life on the road, chasing criminals and sleeping in ditches? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Thomas turned back to Eliza. Come home. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You'll have everything you need. I don't want to be taken care of, Eliza said. I want to live my own life. This isn't living. This is surviving. Maybe, but it's mine. Thomas stepped closer. Eliza, please. I'm trying to help you. No, you're trying to control me, just like you always have. That's not fair, isn't it? You sent me out here with a man I barely knew because you thought it was best for me. And when he died, you didn't come. You didn't write. You just left me there. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, because it was easier to think I was fine than to actually check. Thomas looked like she'd slapped him. That's not true. Then why are you here now? Why didn't you come when I needed you? Because I didn't know you needed me. I always needed you, but you were too busy with your own life to notice. Thomas didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at his sister like he was seeing her for the first time. Caleb cleared his throat. Maybe you two should talk. Alone. Eliza shook her head. No. Anything he has to say, he can say in front of you. Thomas looked at Caleb again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not anger, just resignation. Fine, he said. If that's what you want. Eliza crossed her arms. It is. Thomas sat back down, and after a moment, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed. Caleb stayed standing, leaning against the wall. I'm leaving in the morning, Thomas said. There's a ship heading west from St. Louis in 3 days. I have passage for both of us. I'm not going to St. Louis. Eliza, I'm staying here with Caleb. Thomas's mouth pressed into a thin line. For how long? I don't know. And then what? You'll just keep drifting? Town to town, job to job? If that's what it takes. That's no life. It's better than the one I had. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I know I wasn't there for you, and I'm sorry, but I'm here now. Let me make it right. You can't. I can try. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. I don't need you to fix this, Thomas. I just need you to let me go. Thomas stood. I can't do that. Why not? Because you're my sister. And I'm not leaving you out here with, he gestured at Caleb, with someone who can't even promise you a future. Caleb spoke up. She doesn't need me to promise her anything. She can make her own choices. And you think this is a good choice? I think it's hers to make. Thomas stared at him. You really believe that? I do. Then you're a fool. Caleb shrugged. Maybe. But I'm not the one trying to drag her somewhere she doesn't want to go. Thomas's face darkened. You don't know anything about her. I know enough. Do you? Do you know what she's been through, what she's survived? Some of it. Then you know she deserves better than this. Yeah, I do. That seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He looked at Caleb, then at Eliza, then back at Caleb. If you really believe that, Thomas said slowly, then why are you letting her stay? Caleb met his eyes. Because she asked me to. The room went quiet. Outside, the street was getting busier, voices and footsteps mixing with the sound of horses. Finally, Thomas turned to Eliza. Is that true? Yes. And you're sure? I am. Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. All right, he said. If that's what you want, I won't stop you. Eliza stood. You mean it? I mean it. But if anything happens, if he hurts you, if you change your mind, you come find me. Promise me that. I promise. Thomas picked up his hat from the table. The ship leaves in 3 days. If you're not on it, I'll assume you're staying. I'm staying. He nodded again, then looked at Caleb. Take care of her. I will. Thomas walked to the door, stopped, and looked back at Eliza one more time. I love you, he said. Even if you don't believe it. I believe it, Eliza said quietly. I just don't need it the way you think I do. Thomas left without another word. After Thomas left, the room felt too small. Eliza sat on the bed, staring at the door like she expected her brother to walk back through it. Caleb stood by the window, watching the street below. Neither of them spoke for a long time. You didn't have to defend me, Eliza said finally. I know. So why did you? Caleb turned to look at her. Because he was wrong. About what? About you not being able to make your own choices. Eliza stood and walked over to him. He wasn't completely wrong, though. About the rest of it. What do you mean? About what you're offering me. He's right. It's not much of a life. Caleb looked away. I know. But it's more than I had before. He met her eyes again. That's not saying much. Maybe not, but it's true. They stood there for a moment, close enough that Caleb could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Then Eliza stepped back. What happens now? She asked. Thomas said the ship leaves in 3 days. I'm not getting on that ship. I know, but we need to decide what we're doing. I thought we already did. Caleb shook his head. We said we'd try. That's not the same as having a plan. So make a plan. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I don't know what I'm doing. I've never... He stopped, rubbed his face. I've never done this before. Done what? Stayed. Eliza sat back down on the bed. Then we figure it out together. Caleb wanted to believe it could be that easy, but he'd been on his own too long to think anything came without a cost. Thomas was right about one thing, he said. You deserve better than this. Stop telling me what I deserve. I know what I want. And what's that? You. And a chance to build something that's mine. Caleb looked at her, and something in his chest loosened. Not much. Just enough. Okay, he said. Then let's figure it out. They spent the rest of the morning talking, really talking, about what they wanted, what they feared, what they were willing to risk. It wasn't easy. Caleb kept trying to pull back to warn her off, and Eliza kept pushing forward, refusing to let him retreat into the comfortable distance he'd lived in for years. By midday, they'd settled on something that resembled a plan. They'd leave Ridgeway once the family from Denver arrived to claim the Garricks. They'd head west toward the territories where land was cheap and questions were few. Caleb had enough money from the bounty to buy a piece of ground, maybe build something small. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "What about your work?" Eliza asked. "What about it? You're just going to stop? No more bounties?" Caleb leaned back in the chair. "I don't know. Maybe I take smaller jobs closer to home." "You think you can do that?" "I can try." Eliza smiled. "That's all I'm asking." They left the hotel after that and walked through town. Ridgeway was busier now, people moving in and out of the general store, horses tied up along the street. Caleb kept his hand near his revolver out of habit, but nobody gave them trouble. They stopped at the store, and Eliza bought supplies: flour, coffee, dried beans, things she said they'd need if they were going to be on the trail for a while. Caleb paid without arguing, and the clerk gave them a curious look but didn't ask questions. Outside, Eliza turned to him. "I need to go back." "Back where?" "To the cabin. There are things I left behind, things I want." Caleb frowned. "That's a week out of our way." "I know, but it matters to me." He studied her face. "What kind of things?" "Letters from my husband. A quilt my mother made. Small things. But they're mine." Caleb nodded. "All right. We'll go." "You sure?" "If it matters to you, it matters." Eliza stepped closer and kissed him. It was quick, barely more than a brush of her lips against his, but it left Caleb standing there like he'd been hit. "Thank you," she said. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. They decided to leave the next morning. That gave them one more night in Ridgeway, and Caleb planned to use it to make sure everything was in order. He checked on the horses, restocked his ammunition, and stopped by the sheriff's office to confirm the family from Denver was still coming. Porter was there, boots up on the desk again, reading a newspaper. "They'll be here tomorrow," he said without looking up. "Sent a wire this morning. Said they're bringing a wagon to transport the prisoners." "Good. You leaving after?" "Yeah." Porter lowered the paper and looked at Caleb. "You taking the woman with you?" "That's the plan." "Her brother's not happy about it." "I know. He stopped by earlier, tried to convince me to arrest you." Caleb's hand went to his revolver. "On what charge?" "Kidnapping. I told him that was ridiculous. She's a grown woman. She can go where she wants." "What'd he say to that?" "Nothing. Just left." Porter leaned back in his chair. "But I'll tell you something, Rourke. That man's not done. He's got money, and he's got connections. If he decides to make trouble for you, he can." "Let him try." Porter shrugged. "Your funeral." Caleb left the office and headed back to the hotel. The sun was starting to set, turning the sky orange and red, and the temperature was dropping fast. He found Eliza in her room, packing the few things she'd bought into a worn canvas bag. "Porter says the family's coming tomorrow," Caleb said from the doorway. "Good. He also said your brother tried to have me arrested." Eliza stopped packing. "What?" "He went to the sheriff, claimed I kidnapped you." "That's insane." Porter didn't believe him, but he said Thomas isn't done. Eliza sat down on the bed, the bag in her lap. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's not your fault. He's my brother. And you're not responsible for what he does." She looked up at him. "What if he keeps trying? What if he follows us?" "Then we deal with it." "How?" Caleb stepped into the room and closed the door. "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." Eliza set the bag aside and stood. "I don't want this to be a fight." "I know. But I'm not backing down." "I know that too." She stepped closer. "Promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't leave, no matter what he does or says. Promise me you'll stay." Caleb looked at her, and the fear in her eyes was so raw it made his chest hurt. "I promise," he said, and he meant it. That night, they ate at the hotel's small dining room, thin stew and hard bread washed down with weak beer. The room was crowded, miners and drifters packed around rough-hewn tables, talking loud and laughing louder. Caleb kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. Eliza sat across from him, picking at her food. You think Thomas will show up? Maybe. What will you do if he does? Talk to him. If he'll listen. And if he won't, then I'll make it clear he needs to back off. Eliza set down her fork. I don't want you to hurt him. I won't, unless he makes me. Caleb, I'm not going to let him take you. That's not negotiable. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. They finished eating in silence and went back upstairs. Caleb walked Eliza to her door, waited while she unlocked it, and then hesitated. You want me to stay again? He asked. Eliza smiled. You asking or offering? Both. Then yes. They went inside, and this time there was no pretense. Eliza lay down on the bed, and Caleb stretched out beside her. She rested her head on his chest, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They didn't talk, just lay there, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he'd felt this kind of peace. He couldn't. The next morning, the family from Denver arrived. Caleb was in the sheriff's office when they pulled up in a wagon driven by two men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Behind them, sitting in the back, was an older woman dressed in black, her face hard as stone. Porter stepped outside, and Caleb followed. The woman climbed down from the wagon with the help of one of the men and walked straight to the sheriff. I'm here for the Garrick brothers, she said. Her voice was sharp, clipped. Yes, ma'am. They're inside. Are they alive? Mostly. The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. What does that mean? Frank took a bullet to the leg. He'll live, but he's not walking well. And Thomas? He's fine. She nodded. I want to see them. Porter led her inside, and Caleb stayed outside with the two men. One of them, tall, lean, with a face that looked permanently sunburned, glanced at him. You the one who brought them in? I am. How much trouble did they give you? Enough. The man snorted. Yeah, that sounds about right. Inside, Caleb could hear the woman's voice, sharp and angry, and Frank's shouting back. The argument went on for a few minutes before Porter came back out, looking tired. She wants to talk to you, he said. Caleb went inside. The woman was standing by the cell, arms crossed, looking at the Garricks like they were something she'd scraped off her shoe. When Caleb walked in, she turned to face him. You're Rourke? I am. My name is Margaret Hastings. Those men killed my son. Caleb nodded. I know. I want them to hang. That's not up to me. But you brought them in. You did your part. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope. This is the rest of the bounty. 2,000, as promised. Caleb took it, checked it, and nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure they get what they deserve. I'll testify if it comes to that. Margaret studied him. You look like a man who's seen his share of trouble. I've seen some. Then you know what it's like to lose someone. Caleb thought about his family, dead and gone for years. I do. Good. Then you understand why this matters. She turned back to the cell. Frank was glaring at her, and Tommy was sitting on the floor, head in his hands. You're both going to hang, Margaret said, and I'm going to be there to watch. Neither of them said anything. Margaret left without another word, and the two men loaded the Garricks into the wagon. Caleb watched from the doorway as they drove off, heading back east. Porter came up beside him. That's that then. Yeah. What about you? You sticking around? No. We're leaving today. Good luck. Caleb nodded and walked back to the hotel. Eliza was waiting in the lobby, her bag packed, looking ready to go. When she saw him, she stood. It's done? She asked. It's done. So we can leave? We can. They collected the horses, saddled up, and rode out of Ridgeway without looking back. The sky was clear, the air cold, and the trail stretched out ahead of them like a promise. Caleb didn't know what they'd find at the end of it, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. The ride back to the cabin took longer than Caleb expected. The trail was rough, washed out in places from the storms, and they had to stop more often than he wanted to rest the horses. But Eliza didn't complain. She rode beside him, quiet and steady, and at night they made camp and talked by the fire. On the third day they crossed the river again. The water was lower now, calmer, and they made it across without trouble. On the far bank, Eliza stopped and looked back. "What?" Caleb asked. "I never thought I'd come back this way." "You want to turn around?" "No, I didn't think it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like leaving something behind." Caleb didn't say anything. He just waited. After a moment, Eliza turned her horse and kept riding. They reached the cabin late in the afternoon of the 5th day. It looked smaller than Caleb remembered, more worn down, like the place had aged in the weeks since he'd been there. The door was still hanging crooked on its hinge, and the roof had a new hole near the chimney. Eliza dismounted and stood there, staring at it. "I forgot how bad it was." "You want to go in?" Caleb asked. "Yeah, I do." She walked up to the door and pushed it open. Caleb followed, his hand on his revolver out of habit. Inside, the cabin was cold and empty. The fire had long since gone out, and there was a layer of dust over everything. Eliza walked to the corner where the bed had been and knelt down. She reached under the frame and pulled out a small wooden box. When she opened it, Caleb saw letters tied with string, a few photographs, and a folded piece of cloth. "This is what I came for," she said. "That's it?" "That's it." Caleb looked around the cabin. "You sure there's nothing else?" Eliza stood, clutching the box to her chest. "No, this is all that matters." They left the cabin and didn't look back. Caleb helped Eliza tie the box to her saddle, and they rode out as the sun started to set. That night, they made camp in a clearing near a stream. Caleb built the fire while Eliza tended to the horses, and then they sat together eating dried meat and watching the flames. "Tell me about him," Caleb said. "Who?" "Your husband." Eliza looked at the fire. "Why?" "Because you never talk about him, and I think you should." She was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. "His name was Daniel. He was kind, quiet. He wanted to build something out here, something that mattered. But the land was harder than he thought. And he got sick." She paused. "I tried to save him. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough." "That's not your fault." "I know, but it feels like it." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "You did what you could. That's all anyone can do." Eliza looked at him. "Is that what you tell yourself?" "Sometimes." "Does it help?" "Not really." She almost smiled. "At least you're honest." They sat there for a while longer, holding hands, watching the fire burn down to embers. Then Eliza stood and went to her bedroll. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night." He lay down by the fire and stared at the stars, thinking about Daniel and about all the things he'd lost over the years. People, places, pieces of himself he'd never get back. But for the first time, he thought maybe it was okay. Maybe losing things was just part of living, and maybe the point wasn't to avoid it, but to keep going anyway. The next morning, they woke to frost on the ground. Caleb shook it off his blanket and stood, his breath misting in the cold air. Eliza was already up, crouched by the stream, washing her face. When she straightened, her cheeks were red from the cold. "We should keep moving," she said. "Weather's going to turn." Caleb nodded. He saddled the horses while Eliza packed their gear, and they were on the trail before the sun cleared the trees. They rode west, following the ridgeline, and by midday they could see the mountains in the distance. Snow covered the peaks, bright white against the blue sky. "How far?" Eliza asked. "Another week, maybe more. And then?" "And then we find a place. Build something." "You make it sound easy." "It won't be." "I know." They rode in silence for a while. Then Eliza spoke again. "What if it doesn't work?" Caleb glanced at her. "What do you mean? What if we get there and we can't make it? What if the land's too hard, or the winter's too long, or we just can't?" "Then we try somewhere else." "And if that doesn't work?" "Then we keep trying." Eliza looked at him. "You really believe that?" "I have to." She smiled. "Me too." That night they made camp in a stand of pines that gave them shelter from the wind. Caleb built the fire bigger than usual, and they sat close to it, soaking up the heat. "Tell me something," Eliza said. "Like what?" Something you've never told anyone. Caleb thought about it. I had a sister once. Younger than me. She died when I was 15. How? Fever. Took her in 3 days. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. Eliza leaned against his shoulder. What was her name? Anna? That's a good name. Yeah, it was. They sat there in silence, and Caleb let himself remember. Anna's laugh. The way she used to follow him around. The way she looked at him like he could fix anything. He couldn't fix her. But maybe he could fix this. The next day they crossed into the high country. The trail got steeper, rockier, and the air got thinner. The horses struggled, and they had to stop more often to let them rest. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge that looked out over a valley. It was wide and green, with a river running through the middle and trees scattered along the banks. The mountains rose up on either side, and in the distance, Caleb could see smoke from a settlement. There, Eliza said, pointing. That's it? Could be. They rode down into the valley, following a trail that wound through the trees. The settlement was small, maybe a dozen buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a few houses. People stopped and stared as they rode through, but nobody said anything. Caleb stopped at the store and dismounted. Wait here. He went inside. The storekeeper was an older man with a beard that reached his chest. He looked up when Caleb walked in. Help you? I'm looking to buy land. You know anyone selling? The storekeeper scratched his beard. Depends. How much you got? Enough. There's a piece about 5 miles north of here. Used to belong to a trapper, but he moved on. It's got a cabin, a well, some cleared ground. Owner's asking $300. I'll take it. The storekeeper raised an eyebrow. You don't want to see it first? I trust you. Suit yourself. Caleb paid, got directions, and went back outside. Eliza was still on her horse, waiting. We got a place, he said. Already? Yeah. Where? North of here. About 5 miles. Eliza smiled. Let's go. They rode out of the settlement and followed the directions the storekeeper had given. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, but eventually it opened up into a clearing. In the middle was a small cabin, rough-built but solid, with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged a little on one side. Behind it was a well, and beyond that a few acres of cleared ground. Eliza dismounted and walked up to the cabin. She pushed the door open and looked inside. Then she turned back to Caleb, and she was smiling. It's perfect, she said. Caleb looked at the cabin, at the land, at Eliza standing in the doorway like she belonged there. And for the first time in years, he thought maybe he'd finally found something worth staying for. They spent the next few days making the cabin livable. Caleb fixed the porch, patched the roof, and cleared out the debris that had accumulated inside. Eliza cleaned, swept, and organized their supplies. It was hard work, but they worked together, and by the end of the week the place almost felt like home. At night, they sat on the porch and watched the stars. The air was cold, but the fire inside kept the cabin warm, and they had enough food to last through the winter. You think we can make it? Eliza asked one night. I think we can try. That's not the same as saying yes. I know, but it's the best I've got. Eliza leaned against him. It's enough. They sat there in silence, and Caleb let himself believe it, just for a moment. But the moment didn't last. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of hooves. He sat up fast, hand already on his revolver, and looked out the window. A horse was coming up the trail, moving fast. And on it was Thomas. Caleb swore under his breath and grabbed his coat. He stepped outside, and Eliza followed, still pulling on her boots. Thomas rode into the clearing and stopped. He looked tired, his clothes dusty, his face drawn, but his eyes were hard. I told you not to follow us, Eliza said. I didn't, Thomas said. I went to St. Louis, waited for you to show up. When you didn't, I came looking. How did you find us? Asked around. People remember a woman traveling with a bounty hunter. Caleb stepped forward. You need to leave. I'm not leaving without my sister. She's not going with you. Thomas dismounted. That's not your decision. It's not yours either. Thomas looked at Eliza. Is this really what you want? To live out here in the middle of nowhere with a man who can't even promise you a future? Yes, Eliza said. It is. You're making a mistake. Maybe. But it's mine to make. Thomas shook his head. I can't let you do this. You don't have a choice. Yes, I do. He stepped forward, and Caleb moved to block him. The two men stood there, facing each other, and for a moment it looked like it might come to blows. Then Eliza stepped between them. Stop, she said. Both of you. She turned to Thomas. I know you're trying to protect me, but I don't need protecting. I need you to trust me. I do trust you. I just don't trust him. Then trust me to make my own choices, even if you don't agree with them. Thomas looked at her, and something in his expression softened. I just want you to be safe. I know, but safe isn't the same as happy. Thomas was quiet for a long time, then he nodded. All right, if this is what you want, I won't stop you. You mean it? I mean it, but if anything happens, I'll let you know. Thomas looked at Caleb. You better take care of her. I will. Thomas mounted his horse and turned it back toward the trail. Then he stopped and looked back at Eliza. I'll always be here if you need me. I know. He rode off, and they watched until he disappeared into the trees. Eliza turned to Caleb. Thank you. For what? For not fighting him. I wanted to. I know, but you didn't. Caleb pulled her close. I told you I'd stay. I meant it. Eliza wrapped her arms around him. I know you did. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, and Caleb realized something. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. The days after Thomas left settled into a rhythm Caleb didn't know he was capable of. He woke before sunrise, fed the horses, checked the fence line he'd started building. Eliza tended the cabin, cooked meals from what little they had, and planted seeds in the cleared ground even though it was late in the season and they both knew nothing would grow before the first frost. But she did it anyway, and Caleb didn't ask why. He figured she needed something to build toward, same as he did. At night they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes not, and that was enough. But 3 weeks in, Caleb started to feel it, the old itch, the need to move, to ride out and find work, to do something that felt like what he knew instead of what he was trying to learn. He didn't say anything, didn't want Eliza to think he was already backing out. But she noticed anyway. You're restless, she said one night. Caleb looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling into nothing useful. I'm fine. No, you're not. He set the wood down. I'm trying. I know, but trying doesn't mean you have to pretend. Caleb leaned back against the cabin wall. I don't know how to do this. Sit still. Wait for things to grow. It feels like I'm wasting time. You're not. Then why does it feel that way? Eliza moved closer, sitting beside him on the porch step. Because you've spent your whole life measuring time by what you finish, how many miles you ride, how many jobs you complete. But this is different. This is about what you build, and that takes longer. I don't know if I'm good at it. You won't know unless you keep trying. Caleb looked at her. What if I can't? Then we figure it out, together. He wanted to believe her, but the truth was he didn't know if he had it in him. Sitting still felt like dying slowly. The next morning, a rider came up the trail. Caleb saw him from the porch and stood, hand drifting to his revolver. The man was alone, riding a tired-looking sorrel, and he didn't look like trouble, but Caleb had learned a long time ago that looks didn't mean much. The rider stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised his hands. I'm not here for a fight. Then what are you here for? Caleb called. Looking for Caleb Rourke. You found him. The man dismounted and walked closer. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a sunburned face and clothes that had seen too many miles. He pulled an envelope from his coat and held it out. I was told to give you this. Caleb took it, but didn't open it. Who's it from? Man named Porter, sheriff over in Ridgeway. Caleb's jaw tightened. What's it say? Don't know. He just said it was important. Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in Porter's uneven handwriting. Rourke. Got a job if you want it. Man killed 2 people in a mining camp north of here. Family's offering $1,500 to bring him in, dead or alive. If you're interested, come to Ridgeway. If not, forget I asked. Caleb folded the letter and looked at the young man. Tell Porter I'll think about it. He said you'd say that. He also said to tell you the job won't wait long. Someone else will take it if you don't. Then someone else can have it. The young man shrugged, mounted his horse, and rode off. Caleb stood there for a long time, the letter in his hand, staring at nothing. Eliza came out onto the porch. What was that about? Job offer. From who? Porter, the sheriff in Ridgeway. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at him. You gonna take it? She asked finally. No. You sure? Caleb turned to face her. I said I'd stay. I meant it. I know. But if you need to go, I don't. Eliza stepped closer. Caleb, I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. If you need to work, then work. I just don't want you to lie to yourself about it. I'm not lying. Then what are you doing? Caleb looked down at the letter. I'm trying to figure out who I am if I'm not doing this. And I don't know yet. Eliza took the letter from his hand, looked at it, then handed it back. You don't have to decide right now, but you do have to decide eventually. She went back inside, and Caleb stayed on the porch, holding the letter, feeling the weight of it. $1,500. Enough to buy livestock, tools, everything they'd need to make the land work. Enough to give them a real start. But it would mean leaving. And once he left, he didn't know if he'd come back. That night, Caleb barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Eliza breathe beside him, and wrestled with himself. The job made sense. It was what he knew, what he was good at, and they needed the money. But leaving felt like breaking a promise, not just to Eliza, but to himself. By morning, he still hadn't decided. He got up, fed the horses, and started working on the fence again. The work was mindless, repetitive, and it gave him space to think. But the more he thought, the less clear things became. Around midday, Eliza came out with water and sat on a stump nearby. You're going to take it, aren't you? She said. Caleb stopped hammering. I don't know. Yes, you do. He set the hammer down and turned to face her. If I go, I'm not breaking my promise. I didn't say you were. Then what are you saying? I'm saying you don't have to choose between staying here and being who you are. You can do both. How? By coming back. Caleb looked at her. What if I don't? Then you don't. But I don't think that's what you want. How do you know? Because if it was, you wouldn't still be here. She stood, handed him the water, and walked back to the cabin. Caleb drank, set the cup down, and stared at the half-finished fence. Then he made his decision. He left the next morning. Eliza didn't try to stop him. She packed food, checked his rifle, and helped him saddle Ash. When he was ready to go, she stood by the horse and looked up at him. How long? She asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And then? And then I come back. You promise? Caleb leaned down and kissed her. I promise. He rode out without looking back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew if he did, he wouldn't leave. The ride to Ridgeway took 4 days. Caleb pushed harder than he should have, and by the time he reached the town, Ash was exhausted. He left her at the livery with instructions to give her grain and rest, then walked to the sheriff's office. Porter was at his desk, same as always, boots up, reading. Didn't think you'd come, he said without looking up. Neither did I. Porter set the paper down. You want the job? Depends. Tell me about it. Porter pulled a file from his desk and slid it across. Man's name is Cole Vance, 32, ex-miner, mean drunk. Killed 2 men in a camp fight 3 weeks ago. Witnesses say he started it, beat 1 man to death with a shovel, shot the other. He's been running since. Where is he now? Last I heard, he was holed up in an old trapper's cabin about 20 miles northeast of here. But that was a week ago. Could be anywhere by now. Who's paying the bounty? Families of the dead men. They pooled their money. $1,500 if you bring him in, dead or alive. Caleb studied the file. Vance's face stared back at him from a crude sketch. Hard eyes, scarred jaw, the look of a man who'd stopped caring a long time ago. I'll take it, Caleb said. Good. You got a week before someone else does. Caleb left the office and headed to the general store. He restocked ammunition, bought dried meat and coffee, and asked around about Vance. Nobody had seen him, but a few people had heard rumors. One said he'd been spotted near the mining camps. Another said he'd headed into the high country. Caleb figured the high country made more sense. A man on the run would want distance and cover, and the mountains had plenty of both. He left Ridgeway the next morning and headed northeast. The trail was rough, winding through dense forest and steep ravines. Caleb moved slow, reading the ground, looking for signs. On the third day, he found tracks, fresh, maybe a day old, leading toward a ridge. He followed them. By late afternoon, he spotted the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, tucked into a hollow surrounded by pines. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and lazy. Caleb dismounted, tied Ash to a tree, and moved in on foot. He circled wide, coming at the cabin from the side, and settled into position behind a fallen log about 50 yards out. Then he waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun started to set, and the temperature dropped. Caleb's fingers went numb, but he didn't move. Finally, the door opened. A man stepped out, big, broad-shouldered, matching Vance's description. He walked to a woodpile, grabbed an armful of logs, and turned back toward the cabin. Caleb stood, rifle up. "Cole Vance." The man froze. "Put the wood down," Caleb said. "Slow." Vance dropped the logs and turned. His hand went to his belt where a revolver hung in a worn holster. "Don't," Caleb said. Vance smiled. "You a lawman?" "No." "Then what are you?" "Someone who's taking you in." Vance laughed. "That right?" "That's right." "And if I don't want to go?" "Then I'll kill you and take you in anyway." Vance's smile faded. "You got a name?" "Rourke." "I've heard of you. They say you don't miss." "They're right." Vance looked at the rifle, then at Caleb. "You really think you can take me?" "I know I can." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vance's hand twitched toward his gun. Caleb fired. The bullet hit Vance in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, clutching the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. Caleb walked over, kicked the revolver away, and stood over him. "I said don't." Vance groaned. "You shot me." "You're lucky I didn't kill you." Caleb dragged Vance inside the cabin, tied his hands behind his back, and bandaged the wound well enough to keep him from bleeding out. Then he searched the cabin, found a bottle of whiskey and some dried venison, and settled in for the night. Vance sat against the wall, glaring. "You're making a mistake." "How's that?" "Those men I killed, they had it coming." "Maybe, but that's not for me to decide." "So you're just going to hand me over? Let them hang me?" "That's the plan." Vance spat blood. "You're a coward." Caleb looked at him. "Maybe, but I'm not the one tied up." They left at first light. Caleb put Vance on his own horse, hands tied to the saddle horn, and led him down the trail. The man complained the whole way, about the pain, about the cold, about how unfair it all was. But Caleb ignored him. By the time they reached Ridgeway, Vance had given up talking. Porter was waiting at the office. He took one look at Vance and nodded. "Good work. He's all yours. What about the bounty?" "I'll take it now." Porter counted out $1,500 and handed it over. Caleb pocketed it, turned, and walked out. He didn't stay in Ridgeway. Didn't even stop for a drink. He just got on Ash and rode. The ride back to the cabin took 3 days, and by the time Caleb saw the clearing, he was exhausted. But when he spotted smoke rising from the chimney, something in his chest loosened. He dismounted, tied Ash to the post, and walked up to the cabin. Eliza was inside, stirring something in a pot over the fire. When she heard the door, she turned, and her face lit up. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. Caleb held her tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, and felt something settle inside him. "How'd it go?" she asked. "It went." "You get him?" "I did." "And the money?" Caleb pulled the envelope from his coat and set it on the table. $1,500. Eliza stared at it. That's a lot." "It is." "What are we going to do with it?" Caleb looked around the cabin, at the rough walls, the patched roof, the bed they shared. "Fix this place up, buy livestock, maybe hire some help come spring." Eliza smiled. "You're really staying?" "Yeah, I am." She kissed him, and for the first time in his life, Caleb felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few weeks were the hardest Caleb had ever worked. He used the money to buy lumber, nails, tools, everything they needed to turn the cabin into something solid. He reinforced the walls, rebuilt the porch, fixed the roof properly. Eliza worked alongside him, hammering, sawing, lifting. They were both exhausted by the end of each day, but they kept going. By the time the first snow fell, the cabin was warm and tight. They had a barn for the horses, a shed for tools, and enough firewood stacked to last through winter. One night, as they sat by the fire, Eliza leaned against Caleb's shoulder and said, "I think we're going to make it." Caleb looked at her. "You sound surprised." "I am, a little." "Why?" "Because I didn't think it was possible. But here we are." Caleb wrapped his arm around her. "Here we are." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames. Then Eliza spoke again. "Do you ever regret it? Staying?" Caleb thought about it. "Sometimes. When it's hard. When I don't know what I'm doing." "And the rest of the time?" "The rest of the time, I'm just glad I'm here." Eliza smiled. "Me too." Winter came hard and fast. The snow piled up, covering the ground in a thick white blanket that didn't melt for weeks. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the well overnight, and they had to break the ice every morning just to get a drink. But the cabin held. The fire stayed warm, and they had enough food to last. Caleb took a job in the settlement, helping the blacksmith repair tools and shoe horses. It wasn't much, but it brought in a little money, and it gave him something to do besides stare at the walls. Eliza spent her days inside, sewing, cooking, reading the few books they'd bought. Sometimes she walked out to the barn to check on the horses, but mostly she stayed close to the fire. At night, they talked. About the past, the future, everything in between. And slowly, Caleb started to understand what Eliza had been trying to tell him all along. Staying wasn't about stopping, it was about choosing to be there, choosing to build, choosing to let something matter more than the next job, the next mile, the next fight. It was harder than any bounty he'd ever chased, but it was worth it. Spring came late, but when it finally arrived, the world exploded with life. The snow melted, the river ran high, and the ground turned soft and ready. Caleb and Eliza planted seeds, corn, beans, potatoes, and tended them carefully. They didn't know if anything would grow, but they tried anyway. And slowly things did. Green shoots pushed up through the soil. The horses got fat on fresh grass. The cabin settled into itself, solid and strong. One morning, Caleb woke to find Eliza standing in the doorway, looking out at the land. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking we did it," she said. "We actually did it." Caleb got up and stood beside her. The sun was just coming up, casting long shadows across the clearing. The land stretched out in front of them, raw, rough, beautiful. "Yeah," he said. "We did." Eliza turned to him. "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." She took his hand, and they stood there together, watching the day begin. But the peace didn't last. In early summer, a rider came up the trail. Caleb saw him from the field and walked back to the cabin, wiping dirt from his hands. The rider stopped at the porch and dismounted. He was older, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and a badge pinned to his chest. "You Caleb Rourke?" he asked. "I am." "My name's Harrigan. I'm a marshal out of Denver." Caleb's hand drifted toward his revolver. "What do you want?" "Relax. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to ask for your help." Caleb didn't relax. "With what?" "There's a gang operating out of the territories. 4 men. They've hit 3 banks in the last 2 months, killed 2 lawmen. We've been tracking them, but they're smart. They know the land." "And you think I can help?" "I know you can. I've heard about you, Rourke. You're good at this, better than most." "I'm not doing that anymore. I'll pay you. $1,000 if you help us bring them in." Caleb shook his head. "I said no." Harrigan looked past him toward the cabin. Eliza was standing in the doorway, watching. "You got a good thing here," Harrigan said. "I can see that. But this gang's not going to stop. They're going to keep killing, keep stealing, and eventually they're going to come this way. Then deal with them. We're trying, but we need someone who knows how to track, how to think like them." Caleb looked at Eliza. She didn't say anything, just watched. I'll think about it, Caleb said. Harrigan nodded. Fair enough. I'll be in the settlement for 2 days. If you change your mind, come find me. He mounted his horse and rode off. Caleb stood there for a moment, then walked back to the cabin. Eliza was still in the doorway. You're not going, she said. I know. But you want to. Caleb didn't answer. It's okay if you do, Eliza said. I understand. I don't want to leave you. I know. But if you need to do this, then do it. Caleb looked at her. What if I don't come back? Then I'll know you tried. He stepped closer, took her hands. I don't want to keep doing this. I want to stay here, with you. Then stay. But what if... Stop, Eliza said. Stop looking for reasons to leave. If you want to stay, then stay. If you want to go, then go. But don't make it about me. Make it about what you want. Caleb closed his eyes. I want to stay. Then stay. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Okay. Okay? Yeah, okay. Eliza smiled. Good. Caleb didn't go to the settlement, didn't look for Harrigan. He stayed on the land, worked the fields, and let the marshal leave without him. And it felt right. A week later, another rider came. This time it was Thomas. Caleb was fixing the fence when he saw him. He set down the hammer and walked to meet him. Thomas dismounted and looked around. This is what you've built? It is. It's nice. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You didn't come all this way to compliment my fence. Thomas smiled, just a little. No, I came to see my sister. Eliza came out of the cabin and stopped when she saw him. Thomas. Eliza. They stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Then Eliza walked over and hugged him. Thomas looked surprised, but he hugged her back. I didn't think I'd see you again, Eliza said. I wasn't sure you'd want to. Of course I would. They pulled apart, and Thomas looked at Caleb. Can we talk? About what? About you and my sister. Caleb crossed his arms. What about us? I wanted to apologize. That caught Caleb off guard. For what? For everything. For trying to control her, for not trusting her to make her own choices, for treating you like you weren't good enough. Caleb didn't say anything. I was wrong, Thomas continued. I can see that now. You've built something here, something real, and she's happy. That's all that matters. Eliza stepped between them. Thomas, you don't have to. Yes, I do. He looked at her. I spent so long trying to protect you that I forgot to listen to you, and I'm sorry. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thomas turned back to Caleb. Take care of her. I will. Good. Thomas stayed for dinner. They sat around the table in the cabin eating stew and bread, talking about everything and nothing. It was awkward at first, but slowly the tension eased. By the time Thomas left the next morning, things felt different. Not perfect, but better. Caleb stood on the porch watching him ride away, and Eliza came up beside him. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I think I am. She took his hand. Me too. The summer passed into fall, and the harvest came in better than they'd hoped. They stored enough food to last through winter, sold some to the settlement, and used the money to buy a cow and a few chickens. The land started to feel like theirs, not just a place they lived, but a place they belonged. One night, as they sat by the fire, Eliza said, I have something to tell you. Caleb looked up. What? I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Caleb set down the cup he'd been holding and stared at her. You're sure? I'm sure. Caleb didn't know what to say. He'd never thought about being a father, never imagined it was something he'd want. But now, looking at Eliza, he felt something shift inside him. How do you feel about it? He asked. Scared, excited, both. Me too. Eliza moved closer, sat beside him. You're going to be a good father. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Caleb put his arm around her. I'll try. That's all anyone can do. The baby came in the spring. It was a boy, small, red-faced, loud. Eliza held him close, and Caleb stood there, looking down at this tiny life they'd created, and felt something he'd never felt before. Fear, joy, responsibility, all of it at once. What should we name him? Eliza asked. Caleb thought about it. Daniel, after your husband. Eliza looked up at him, eyes wet. Are you sure? I'm sure. He was part of your life. He should be part of this too. She smiled. Thank you. They named him Daniel, and he became the center of everything. Caleb worked the land harder than ever, building a future for his son. Eliza cared for the baby, sang to him, taught him to smile. And together, they built a life that neither of them had thought possible. Years passed. Daniel grew, the land prospered, and Caleb never left. There were hard times. Winters when the cold nearly broke them. Summers when the drought killed half the crops. Times when Caleb wondered if he'd made the right choice. But he never left, because he'd learned something in those years. Something Eliza had been trying to teach him all along. Staying wasn't about giving up the life he'd known. It was about choosing a different kind of strength. The kind that came from planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. From building something that would last longer than he would. From loving someone more than he feared losing them. It was harder than any bounty, harder than any fight, but it was worth it. One evening, years later, Caleb sat on the porch with Daniel beside him. The boy was 10 now, tall and lean, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. Dad, Daniel said, tell me a story. Caleb looked at him. What kind of story? A true one. About when you were younger. Caleb thought about it. About the years he'd spent running, the men he'd chased, the things he'd done. I used to think the only thing that mattered was the next job, he said, the next mile, the next fight. I thought staying in one place meant I was giving up. And now? Now I know the hardest thing I ever did was stop running. Daniel looked at him. Why was it hard? Because I didn't know who I was if I wasn't moving. I had to learn. Did you? Caleb looked out at the land, at the fields they'd planted, the barn they'd built, the life they'd made. Eliza was in the doorway watching them, smiling. Yeah, Caleb said. I did. Daniel nodded, satisfied. Good. They sat there together watching the sun set, and Caleb realized something. He wasn't running anymore. He was home, and he always would be. Because in the end, the frontier wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about how far you could ride or how many fights you could win. It was about finding the one thing worth staying for, and choosing it every single day. That was the real fight, and Caleb had finally won.